Let's kick things off with a discussion on GTO versus exploitative poker. This is something that's pretty much discussed as part of every training resource online, but in 99% of cases, it's handled inaccurately. So if we do nothing else in this part of the course, we should walk away with an accurate understanding of the difference between GTO poker and exploitative poker, and whether it's okay to pick and choose. Is it okay to simply decide to be a GTO player, for example? GTO stands for Game Theory Optimal. It's a strategy that represents the perfect way of playing poker. It's based around a branch of mathematics known as game theory, and the colloquial way of explaining game theory is it's the mathematics behind making decisions. And in poker, there's always a perfect decision that can be made given a certain situation. If we play a GTO strategy, it means that we have no weaknesses. There's no counter strategy that our opponent can employ that will damage our win rate because we are always making the correct play from a mathematical perspective. Now, that sounds amazing. Unfortunately, it's not quite as good as it might appear because it's generally inferior to an exploitative strategy. An exploitative strategy in poker is where we deliberately target our opponent's weaknesses. We see he's making a mistake in a certain part of the game, and we deliberately construct our strategy to take advantage of our opponent's mistakes. Now, because we are no longer playing GTO poker when we look to target our opponent's mistakes, it technically means that we are now open to counter-exploitation. Although we've increased our win rate by targeting our opponent's mistakes, we've technically opened up some weaknesses in our own strategy that an astute opponent might be able to counter. So which of these two approaches is best? And the way that it's made out in most training content online is that it's a choice you get to make. Some players decide that they are going to be GTO poker players. They spend all of their time working on GTO strategies. They don't care what their opponents are doing. Other types of players decide that they are going to play exploitatively. They don't care about GTO. They just look at the mistakes their opponents are making and try and target those mistakes. You may even run into debates on the forums in terms of which is better. Should you be a GTO player or should you be an exploitative player? Unfortunately, you've already been misled at this stage. This is not a choice that you just simply get to make. At least it shouldn't be. The only objective of a serious poker player is to play exploitative poker. Another fact that's commonly glossed over is that GTO poker itself is a type of exploitative strategy. Imagine we had an opponent who was playing perfect poker. We sometimes refer to perfect poker as a Nash equilibrium. Imagine we had an opponent playing a perfect Nash strategy. What is the counter solution against that particular strategy? The counter response that generates the highest win rate in that scenario is to also play a Nash strategy. In other words, GTO poker is simply the solution, the maximum exploit against another player who also just so happens to be playing a perfect GTO solution to the game of poker. It's often made out that GTO poker and exploitative poker are two different sides of the same coin, whereas the reality is they actually occupy the same side of the coin because GTO poker is actually a type of exploitative poker. It's the maximum exploit strategy against an opponent who's playing a perfect Nash strategy. If we now imagine that we have an opponent who's not playing a perfect strategy, and by the way, this refers to every poker player ever. One of the ironies of, quote, GTO players is that the full GTO solution to poker is so complex that it's debatable whether a human player would ever be able to implement a perfect GTO strategy, even if the solution was dumped in front of them on their desk. And even if it was dumped in front of them, perhaps the desk would collapse under the weight of trillions of pieces of paper because the full solution to No Limit Hold'em is absolutely massive. So we know that our opponent has to be playing a strategy that is deviating from a GTO solution. What happens if we try and play a GTO strategy against an opponent who is not playing GTO poker? We don't maximize our win rate against that player. It's that simple. And that's why, in general, the win rates achieved through playing exploitative poker are significantly higher than the win rates achieved through playing a perfect GTO game. And that's always going to be true regardless of the environment. So long as you have players in your environment who are making mistakes, the win rate you can achieve through exploitative play could potentially be massive compared to the win rate you would achieve via a perfect GTO strategy. Now, it could be in some environments that if you did play a perfect GTO strategy, you would still be winning. And perhaps some players are satisfied with that. They're not playing the best strategy, but they are playing a strategy that could potentially win, even though it doesn't generate the maximum win rate. In my opinion, you should absolutely not be satisfied with that. If you are investing a certain amount of your precious time to sit down and, let's say, play 1,000 hands of poker, why would you settle for making $50 when you could be making $300 for that same time investment? The goal here should absolutely be to maximize our profits, and the way we do that is very clearly through exploitative play. Besides, there is a question mark over whether a perfect GTO strategy is even profitable in some environments. It is going to be related to the rake taken by that environment. Now, it's certainly true that our opponents won't be able to generate a positive win rate against us if we were playing a perfect GTO strategy. But remember, our win rate against our opponents has to be enough to beat the rake in order for us to be able to profit. Imagine a very high-raked environment. It's certainly possible that we could be outperforming our opponents, but losing to the rake. The objective here is not simply to beat our opponents, it's to beat our opponents by enough of a clip that we can still profit after we've made rake payments to the poker room. When we actually look at GTO strategy, we see that many lines that a game theory optimal approach would take are directly losing against an average opponent. Very simple example, imagine a river situation where GTO is making a bet, and GTO has to make sure that in that betting range there are both value hands and bluffs in order for the strategy to be balanced, so it can't be exploited or countered. But what if our opponent just never folds in that specific river situation? All of the bluffs are going to be directly losing against that opponent. So we have a decision to make. Do we just keep on bluffing anyway and say, well, at least my opponent can't counter this strategy. I know that I'm hemorrhaging chips every time I bluff here, but at least my opponent can't adjust against me. Or do we say, my bluffs are losing money, I'm going to stop bluffing. All of a sudden, my overall win rate is significantly higher as a result of that adjustment. We see many training videos where players are advised, or it's at least indirectly implied, that players should be employing GTO solutions directly in game. And there are many successful cash game players who claim that they are playing a GTO approach to poker. And this is despite the fact, as we've already mentioned, that it's not actually possible at this stage for a human to play a perfect GTO game of poker. The solution to poker, the GTO perfect solution, is not actually even known at this stage. So already when someone claims that they are playing GTO poker, there has to be some level of skepticism surrounding those claims. What we may actually find when, let's say, a high stakes crusher says that they are playing, quote, GTO poker, they're actually playing an exploitative style of poker that is somewhat informed by GTO principles. And this is actually something that can be very powerful. We're not here to say that you shouldn't be looking at GTO or that you shouldn't be analyzing poker through a GTO lens. A deeper understanding of game theory optimal poker is definitely one of, if not the biggest advancement that poker players have made over the last decade. Having access to GTO solver output is great for understanding the underlying mechanics of poker, and there's no reason why you shouldn't understand that. The best exploitative poker players absolutely make use of game theory optimal tools like poker solvers. For example, it's great as a reference for formulating baseline strategies in specific scenarios. Now, it's important that we mention in specific scenarios because there are some scenarios where you absolutely do not want to be paying attention to a GTO strategy. It really depends on how much your opponent or how much the player pool is actually deviating from what would be a theoretically optimal approach in that specific scenario. If they're too far away from a GTO approach, then using solver output as a reference for formulating a baseline strategy could end up being a mistake. It's fairly clear that there is some discernment and experience required in how to fully leverage the power of solver output. And that's something that's just completely lacking in the poker industry in general. That's why we have an abundance of training content that seems to imply that you should be using GTO poker directly as part of your strategy. And this is not really a problem. Misconceptions are expected, and they're even desired. The fact that our opponents don't fully understand the distinction between GTO and exploitative poker is what creates the possibility for professional play. We're exploiting the average misunderstanding of a poker player in our environment. Hopefully at this stage, you understand that the objective is to play exploitative poker. And in some ways, this is a simplification if you are wondering to yourself how exactly you were going to shape your poker career, whether you were going to be a GTO player or an exploitative player. Well, now you know there really is only one path here, and that is to exploit your opponents as hard as possible in a quest to generate the maximum win rate. But if we want to play exploitatively, then we need exploitative strategies. And here is where we reach another area of poker that the average poker player, including the average big winner at poker, is very confused about in general. And that is, how exactly do we derive exploitative strategies? The majority of poker players, even the majority of training schools, cannot answer this question accurately. How do we derive exploitative strategies? Since it's such a fundamental aspect of the way that we should be approaching the game, it's something we're going to be talking about consistently throughout the rest of the crash course: how to play exploitative poker. The simple answer in terms of how we derive exploitative poker is that it's based on maths. And in some cases, the maths that's involved, not necessarily too difficult. We also use another term, EV modeling. EV stands for expected value in poker and determines the expected profit of a certain play over the long run. On a simple level, if we want to understand what the best exploit is in a certain situation, it's simply a case of comparing a range of different lines, calculating their expected value, and seeing which line generates the highest expected value. The line that generates the highest expected value, we can refer to that as the max exploit. But it's one thing to say, let's compare the EVs of certain lines, but we need to be able to calculate the EV of various lines to begin with. This is where EV calculations comes in. Many players don't fully understand how EV calculations work, but it's a fundamental core principle in terms of developing exploitative strategies. We can say the exact same for statistics and probability. We don't have to understand these concepts on an exceptionally deep level, but we do need to understand the basics of how they work in order to be able to perform EV calculations. There is some aspect of exploitative play which is not purely based on maths, but is based on intuition and experience. I generally break exploitative poker decisions down into two categories: tactics and strategy. Tactics is the mathematical part of the game tree where we're running EV calculations and comparing different lines, whereas strategy is the general approach to the game of poker. We're going to be talking about this a little bit later in the course, but just to give you an example of exploitative strategy. Let's say, for example, a weaker player at the table decides to open raise. We're in the big blind and we decide to defend our big blind wider as a result of the fact that it's a weaker player that open raised and we want to play heads up against the weaker player. Now, our decision is not GTO correct because we've deliberately expanded our big blind defending range because we want to play heads up against the weaker player. Furthermore, it's very, very difficult to determine how much we're actually increasing our EV by defending a wider range in that situation. Having said that, it seems logical that it's the right direction to be expanding in. We want to play more hands against the weaker players. We know that our EV is likely to be higher in that situation. There's no explicit calculation there, but we are deliberately deviating from GTO in an attempt to improve our win rate. That's an example of exploitative strategy. And since we won't always know concretely how much we're affecting our EV by, we can refer to this as something that happens on an intuitive level. We sense that this is a good situation to get involved wider in the pot. When we start dealing with exploitative tactics, that's a lot more specific. We can demonstrate and verify with EV calculations that one line is superior to another. More on that later in the course. If you ask the average poker player, average poker coach, average training school, how do we generate exploitative strategies? The answer you'll typically get is by using node locking with a solver. Not only does this demonstrate a fairly grave misunderstanding of how solvers work, but it also demonstrates a misunderstanding of how exploitative strategies work, period. It's virtually impossible to generate a pure exploitative strategy making use of solver node locks. Without getting into too much detail, in order to use a solver to generate a pure exploitative strategy, we'd have to node lock every single decision node in a game tree, which is just not practical. And it's not how players use solvers. Even if they claim that they are generating exploitative strategies, that's usually as a result of locking a single node on a game tree. It's impossible to create max exploit strategies using a single node lock on a solver. Now, if you're not sure exactly what I'm talking about, don't worry too much. This is a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about right now. We will get onto slightly more advanced GTO and solver related concepts later on in the course. Just take a couple of key takeaways from this. Number one, node locking is not how you generate exploitative strategies in poker. We have to use EV modeling for that. And takeaway number two, the industry in general, this includes high stakes players, this includes poker coaches, this includes training sites. The industry in general does not understand how exploitative strategies are derived. Don't worry too much. This is exactly why you're here watching the Cash Crash course. We're going to be exploring exploitative strategies throughout the rest of this course. And there's no reason why we can't propel your understanding of exploitative strategies into the top 1% of all poker players. So that wraps up our initial discussion on GTO versus exploitative. Hopefully you've taken away from this that GTO versus exploitative is a bit of a bogus comparison because GTO poker is a type of exploitative poker. The main objective of any poker player is to look at the mistakes that their opponents are making and use that information to maximize their win rate.